Freezing rain washes over the slick cobblestones of a narrow Harlem alleyway, mixing with the hot, red blood pooling beneath a massive, lifeless body. A man stands over the corpse in the dead of the 1932 winter, his breath rising in ragged white clouds. He slowly wipes a bone-handled switchblade across the dead man's ruined cashmere coat. The rage in his chest is a heavy, burning stone. A beloved elder of his community was just brutally beaten, his bones shattered by the very enforcer now bleeding out in the flooded gutter. The sharp, metallic click of the closing blade echoes off the wet brick walls, sealing a terrifying, violent promise. We all know what it feels like to be pushed too far, to watch greedy, arrogant people step on the vulnerable while the law looks the other way. When ruthless downtown syndicates tried to violently strip away the only wealth working-class Harlem had left, they used sadistic force to break the neighborhood's spirit. They targeted the old and the defenseless just to send a message. It is the kind of unchecked, enraging injustice that makes your blood boil and demands an immediate response. But answering that kind of brutality with a blade comes with a permanent, soul-crushing cost. How does a quiet, poetry-reading ex-convict cross that fatal line, transforming in a single night into the most feared underworld kingpin in American history? Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked into that dark trap as a loyal lieutenant, but the man who walked out would brutally rule New York's shadows for decades. This was not just a killing. It was a loud, bloody declaration of war. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The air in the winter of 1932 Harlem tasted of bitter coal smoke, roasting chestnuts, and cheap bootleg gin. Up in the heavily guarded brownstones of Sugar Hill, Madame Stephanie St. Clair commanded an illegal, multi-million-dollar empire built entirely on the copper pennies and silver nickels of the working class. She was the absolute queen of the policy rackets, running the neighborhood's underground lottery with an iron grip. Guarding her massive fortune was a man named Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Recently released from a harsh upstate penitentiary, Bumpy spent his quiet hours absorbing the poetry of Shakespeare, his intensely sharp mind constantly analyzing power dynamics and calculating odds. He was fiercely loyal, operating as a human shield standing between St. Clair's hard-earned cash boxes and anyone foolish enough to reach for them. He carried a heavy switchblade in his wool coat, but he kept his hair-trigger temper locked down tight, always choosing cold logic over reckless violence. Miles away in lower Manhattan, cold desperation was taking hold. With the insanely profitable era of Prohibition rapidly coming to a close, ruthless white mob bosses turned their greedy, violent eyes uptown. They wanted St. Clair's incredibly lucrative banks, and they completely refused to accept her independence. To force a hostile, bloody takeover, the downtown bosses unleashed a massive, sadistic enforcer known as Desmond the Vulture Gallagher. Gallagher was a blunt, terrifying instrument of pain, specifically hired to crack skulls, snap limbs, and terrorize the tight-knit community into absolute submission. He patrolled the rain-slicked Harlem avenues with heavy, arrogant boots, loudly boasting in local speakeasies that a total slaughter was imminent if St. Clair didn't immediately hand over her crown. The pressure was suffocating, closing in on the neighborhood from all sides. Don't miss the next twist in this dark history. Subscribe right now. Gallagher wasn't interested in peaceful negotiations or cutting a percentage deal. He only understood the brutal currency of physical domination and raw terror. To force St. Clair's hand, Gallagher needed to make a horrific public example. He found his perfect, vulnerable target in Elias Thorne, one of St. Clair's most trusted and beloved elderly numbers runners. Elias was a gentle, frail man with thinning gray hair who walked his daily collection route with a warm smile, entirely defenseless against a towering, seasoned brawler. Gallagher ambushed the old man in a freezing, trash-choked alleyway right behind a blaring jazz club. The savage, one-sided beating that followed left Elias as a broken, shattered heap on the freezing asphalt, gasping for air and coughing up blood into the dirty winter slush. But the horrific physical damage wasn't the final, crushing insult. Before striding away into the freezing rain, Gallagher took a piece of heavy paper and viciously pinned a stark, handwritten note directly to Elias's torn, wet winter coat. What was specifically written on that scrap of paper was intentionally kept quiet. But when Bumpy Johnson finally looked down at Elias and read those blood-smeared words, something inside his mind permanently snapped. The calm, intellectual strategist instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating executioner preparing for an all-out war. The basement safe house smelled of damp earth, stale cigar smoke, and fresh blood. Elias lay on a crude wooden cot, his breathing a wet, ragged wheeze. One eye was swollen completely shut, the dark purple and black bruising spreading across his frail cheekbones like ink dropped in dirty water. When Bumpy stepped into the dim light, he didn't speak. He just stared at the old man's ruined face, and then at the crumpled, blood-stained note resting on the table beside him. The heavy, oppressive weight of the moment crushed the air out of the room. In that silent basement, a fundamental shift occurred. The careful, defensive strategist vanished forever. Bumpy realized that playing by the rules against rabid dogs only resulted in more butchered friends. He was going on the offense. The Onyx Lantern Speakeasy was a suffocating underground cavern crammed beneath a 133rd Street tailoring shop. Thick clouds of cheap tobacco smoke choked the air, mixing with the heavy scent of spilled gin and cheap perfume. A wailing saxophone cut through the murmurs of the crowded room, masking the illegal transactions happening in every dark corner. Bumpy pushed past the sweaty bodies, his face a cold, emotionless mask, and slid into a sticky leather booth opposite Silas. Silas was a nervous, twitchy fence who traded in stolen goods and whispered intelligence. Bumpy didn't waste time with greetings. He slapped a crisp $50 bill onto the scarred wooden table. Silas swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit, before quickly sliding the cash into his coat. In exchange, he surrendered Desmond Gallagher's exact movement schedule, confirming the massive enforcer would be collecting extortion money at a back-alley betting parlor near Lenox Avenue later that night. Armed with his target's exact location, Bumpy returned to his Stark apartment to prepare for war. He stood before his dresser, staring down at a heavy, snub-nosed .38 revolver and a custom-made, bone-handled switchblade. The gun was loud, chaotic, and guaranteed to draw corrupt, trigger-happy beat cops straight to the scene. The blade was silent. It was intimate. It sent a definitive, bloody message to the downtown syndicates. Bumpy grabbed the cold bone handle, sliding the knife deep into his wool overcoat pocket. This was a calculated, irreversible decision to commit premeditated murder. He wasn't calling the authorities. He was becoming a monster to slaughter a monster. Comment below. Would you cross that line to protect your own, or find another way? He stepped out into the biting winter storm, fully committed to the carnage ahead. If you want to survive these deadly twists, hit subscribe right now. How long would you wait in the dark to look the devil in the eye? Bumpy stood completely motionless behind a stack of rotting wooden shipping crates, the freezing rain soaking through his thick coat and chilling him to the bone. The alley was a perfect, claustrophobic trap, walled in by towering brick fire escapes that completely choked out the moon. The only illumination came from the glowing red ember of his cupped cigarette, a tiny, burning beacon in an ocean of black water. He didn't shiver. He didn't pace. He simply waited for the heavy, arrogant boots of a man who thought Harlem was a defenseless playground. The storm raged on, but inside Bumpy's mind, everything was dead quiet. The hunt had officially ended, and the execution was about to begin. The heavy iron bell from a distant clock tower strikes midnight, the low tolls vibrating through the freezing downpour. The rusted metal door of the back alley betting parlor groans open, violently breaking the dead silence of the night. A thick wedge of yellow light spills out, reflecting sharply off the flooded cobblestones and framing the massive, hulking silhouette of Desmond Gallagher. He steps over the threshold, forcefully pulling his expensive wool collar up against the bitter, biting wind. Pausing by a waterlogged, overflowing trash can, he strikes a match against the rough brick wall. The brief orange flare illuminates his scarred, pugilistic face and the cruel, arrogant smirk permanently etched into his hardened features. He puffs a thick, imported cigar, the heavy gray smoke instantly swallowed by the raging storm. He walks away from the parlor with a slow, unbothered swagger, his heavy boots splashing through the freezing puddles. He believes he completely owns this city, completely unaware that he just willingly walked into a tomb. Gallagher moves deeper into the narrow, claustrophobic corridor of rusted fire escapes. The heavy metal parlor door slams forcefully shut behind him, completely cutting off the light and plunging the alley back into a crushing, watery blackness. Suddenly, a glowing red cigarette ember arcs through the heavy rain, hissing loudly as it hits a dark puddle. Bumpy steps out from the pitch-black shadows of the stacked wooden crates, stepping directly into Gallagher's path. He completely seals off the only exit leading out to the main street. "You're a long way from downtown." Bumpy's voice cuts directly through the sound of the downpour. A smooth, low baritone completely stripped of all human emotion. Gallagher stops dead in his tracks. He squints hard through the driving rain, his thick fingers instinctively dropping toward the heavy bulge of the revolver resting securely in his overcoat pocket. He recognizes the lone, slender figure blocking his path and lets out a harsh, barking laugh, the rainwater running heavily down his thick chin. "St. Clair's errand boy," Gallagher sneers, aggressively chomping down on the wet end of his cigar. "You better step back into the dark, son, or I'll break you a hell of a lot worse than I broke that old, pathetic numbers runner." Gallagher is a seasoned, brutal brawler, a massive wall of muscle built to intimidate and destroy. He aggressively yanks the heavy revolver upward. But Bumpy is coiled lightning. Before the dark gun barrel can clear the heavy wool fabric, Bumpy lunges forward. The sudden movement is a terrifying blur of calculated violence. A sharp, mechanical click cuts directly through the rain, sounding louder than a crack of thunder. The bone-handled switchblade springs open. A brutal, desperate struggle violently erupts against the slick, wet brick wall. Gallagher throws a wild, massive haymaker punch aimed squarely at Bumpy's temple. Bumpy ducks instantly, slipping under the fist with a deadly dancer's grace, and drives his knee brutally into the larger man's unprotected abdomen. The air forcefully escapes Gallagher's lungs in a heavy, wet grunt. The giant stumbles backward, slamming heavily into the rough brick. Bumpy doesn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He keeps the violence close, intimate, and perfectly quiet to avoid drawing the corrupt local beat cops. He makes his final, lethal move. The steel blade finds its mark. It is swift, clinical, and completely uncompromising. Gallagher gasps sharply, his eyes blowing wide in absolute shock as the cold metal pierces his chest. His knees buckle instantly. He slumps heavily down the wall, collapsing onto the slick pavement. His dropped cigar lands in the flooded gutter, sputtering out in the dark rainwater. Bumpy stands completely motionless over the massive body, his chest heaving slightly as the icy rain washes over the brim of his fedora. The distant wail of a police siren echoes from somewhere near 125th Street, but the alley itself returns to a deafening, heavy silence. Bumpy bends down, calmly wiping the bloody steel blade clean on Gallagher's ruined cashmere coat. But what Bumpy left in that alley completely changed the entire context of the conflict. He didn't just kill a man and hide the body in the shadows. He intentionally left the corpse right out in the open, fully exposed for the morning crowds to discover. It was a gruesome, undeniable billboard designed explicitly for the Dutchman and the entire ruthless New York mafia. Leaving Gallagher rotting in the gutter wasn't just revenge for a beaten friend. It was a loud, formal declaration of war that would permanently ignite the streets of Harlem. Only subscribers uncover the full truth. Hit subscribe so you aren't left behind. The downtown syndicates would soon retaliate with brutal force, but the era of them treating Harlem like an easy mark was officially dead. Bumpy fades seamlessly back into the pitch-black labyrinth of 1930s New York. He avoids the brightly lit main avenues, navigating the twisting, flooded backstreets with the measured stride of a ghost until he reaches the heavy oak doors of Madame Stephanie St. Clair's guarded Sugar Hill brownstone. Inside the lavish home, the aggressive crackle of a massive roaring fireplace fights off the bitter winter chill. St. Clair waits in a plush velvet armchair, a thick leather ledger resting quietly on her lap. Bumpy crosses the expensive Persian rug, his heavy wool coat dripping freezing rain, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of fresh blood into the room. He doesn't speak a single word. He walks straight to her mahogany desk, his hands completely steady, and pours 2 fingers of neat amber bourbon into a heavy crystal glass. St. Clair slowly closes her ledger. A definitive, heavy thud echoes through the warm, quiet study. She looks directly into Bumpy's eyes and instantly sees the irreversible change. The quiet, intellectual ex-convict who found solace reading Shakespeare in his lonely cell died permanently in that flooded alleyway. Standing before her is the newly forged Godfather of Harlem. His gaze hardened into cold steel. They both know the brutal reality of their new world. The downtown mobs will strike back violently to reclaim their lost pride, but the days of them treating uptown like an easy, defenseless mark are officially over. A singular, bloody act of defiance has violently shifted the entire power dynamic of the city. Harlem is no longer prey. It has grown razor-sharp teeth. We've all faced moments where we had to stand up to bullies. We all know the hot, blinding rush of anger when someone targets the vulnerable people we love and protect. But Bumpy's story asks a much darker, heavier question. What happens when standing your ground means becoming the very thing you are fighting? To shield his community from vicious monsters, Ellsworth Johnson had to completely embrace his own capacity for ruthless, calculated violence. He successfully secured his neighborhood's borders, but he bought that safety by sacrificing a massive piece of his own humanity. The streets were finally defended, but the protector was forever changed. If you're still not subscribing, drop a comment. What's holding you back?